one cannot rule out the possibility of Putin trying to do something truly wild and bizarre, like attacking in the Baltic.
Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center, and a contributor to the Bulwark. And I'm joined by my partner in all things strategery, Eliot Cohen, professor emeritus of strategy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and a contributing writer to The Atlantic. Eliot, how are you? I am actually in chilly Eastern Shore, Virginia, where we've got very rough surf and nice breezes blowing.
Well, I'm in the balmy Washington D.C. suburbs, but before too long we'll be off to the Catskills, where I assume it'll be nice and cool as well. Before I introduce our guest, as always, I am perplexed by how to choose among the jackasseries of the week. There are so many this week in particular. The one I think I want to focus on is Kevin Hassett, who's the president's economic advisor, with a feeble grin on his face, defending the firing of the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, because the numbers just don't feel good. And it's, it's one of a number of cases that we've seen recently of people basically kind of going along with whatever the president wants, even if they have better judgment. And the thing about Hassett is, okay, this is a guy who's worked in Republican administrations. He worked for John McCain. He's a sensible, kind of middle of the road Republican economist. And he's going out there and defending something that's indefensible and looking pretty silly as he does it. And you do wonder about what the long-term consequences are, given that the president really does seem to be surrounded by people who have decided to sacrifice their integrity to support whatever the party line is. I don't know what your view of all that is.
No, I agree. I mean, unfortunately, I've seen this movie before. I mean, the firing, the heads of statistical institutions because they produce numbers you don't like is not unique to Donald Trump. I mean, 3 years ago, Recep Tayyip Erdogan did exactly the same thing in Turkey. So, I've as I said, I've seen the movie before. I mean, look, there's a larger problem, which is potentially this is, something that can get to the credibility of official government statistics, make it more difficult for people to make judgments about investments, et cetera. So there's a more serious side to the, otherwise King Canute-like instinct that it, reveals. I mean, my choice for jackassery this week would be our hardy perennial, the Secretary of Defense, who, as you said last week, is the gift who keeps on giving. I mean, his complaint about the Inspector General report that is underway over Signalgate and denouncing it as a witch hunt, because every investigation now is obviously a witch hunt, just is, just more indication of his unfitness for the job. Although more seriously, I am concerned about the reports that his brother, who is the DHS liaison to the DOD, is working on getting DOD to become even more involved in law enforcement on the border, which I think is a more serious and troubling development for the department.
Yeah, well, there's other stuff there too. I'm putting the finishing touches on an article for The Atlantic about the Hegseth's purge of civilian academics from the military academies, but it's not going to stop there, and what the consequences of that are. This is all very depressing. As when we move to something a little bit more cheery, which is our guest, who I would like to introduce. So this is truly one of the most remarkable scholars that I've ever met, somebody who mentored me a bit while I was a professor and then a dean at CACI. And that's Fred Starr. So Fred has it's an extraordinary resume. He was the founding director of the Kennan Institute for Advanced Russian Studies. That's in the mid-70s, which was a remarkable operation, alas, since closed down by the administration. President of Oberlin College for over a decade, president of the Aspen Institute, founder and chairman of the Central Asia Caucasus Institute, and a lot more. Somebody who's spent a lot of time advising government, and an amazing author. You may want to speak as somebody who served in Moscow to one of my favorite books of his, Red and Hot, The Fate of Jazz in the Soviet Union, which is actually quite an important book. By the way, Fred is a very talented jazz musician. He's written about the Garden District of New Orleans. He's written several books, of course, about Russia and Eurasia. He's written a biography of Louis Moreau Gottschalk, very famous composer. And I think one of my favorite books, Lost Enlightenment, Central Asia's Golden Age from the Arab Conquest to Tamerlane. So an extraordinarily broad-gauged intellect, somebody who I admire enormously. And we're delighted to have him on. I think before we give him a chance to talk, you should say something about Red Hot.
Well, I'll just say that Red and Hot was one of the books I read before I went to Moscow in the late 1980s that I enjoyed the most of all the books in Soviet studies that I got to read. It's a really remarkable and terrific and fun read. And so, Fred, I'm massively indebted to you as well.
Well, let me make a quick comment on that. Yes, it's a book about jazz in the Soviet Union. The real subject was, can the state control society? And the conclusion was, no, it doesn't work. However, the Sovietological establishment chose to ignore that and instead groove on anecdotes about jazz musicians in Russia, completely missing the point.
Yeah, I remember being struck by it and saying, look, if even Stalin couldn't suppress jazz, then what does that tell you? And I think, one thing maybe we can draw you out of it a little bit on later on is, as Russia moves to an increasingly authoritarian, I don't know whether totalitarian is the right word, but something like that, a much more increasingly controlling society, and increasingly controlling government, do the same kind of limits still obtain? But in any case, Fred, welcome. And we'd like, if we could, to begin by asking you to talk to us about Russia. You've been spending a lot of time following Russia and Ukraine, and following it not just by reading the news, but by kind of digging into what bloggers on both sides are saying. Could you give us your take on what is happening now with Russia? And then we'll go in other directions after that.
Well, first, a word about the coverage of it in our press. It's curious that they are fascinated with wherever the front line is today or tomorrow. Did it move 100 yards this way or that way? Absolutely, there's next to no attention to the logistics, everything going on behind the front. And on that, even though it's a sort of stalemate on the front line, logistically, it's a state of collapse for Russia. And we've more or less missed this. Russians are very candid about it. The zealot, what they call Z bloggers, it's a wonderful term. The super patriot chauvinist bloggers are all united in saying, it's all over. We cannot sustain it. We've screwed up, and now they're beginning to talk quite openly of what's the path out from this. So that's not where we are as we discuss them at all. It's two separate discourses.
By the way, why do the Russians give as much tolerance as they apparently do to critical bloggers admittedly from the right, if that's the right word, as they do? I mean, is it just because they figure they want to let people let off steam? Is this a way that they get some sense of what's going on? I mean, it is striking how harshly critical some of those people on Telegram and elsewhere can be.
I think your term letting off steam is right, but this is a very recent development. For the first 2.5 years of the war, the Russian Z bloggers were, they were leading the charge. Let's go for it. Why stop at Ukraine? This was their message. And the process by which individually each of them flip-flopped is part of the history that's very important, but they aren't the only ones. If you take as establishment a figure, and by the way, a very competent one, is Elvira Nabiullina, who's head of the National Bank. She's a very competent lady. I mean, she's the real thing. And even though she has mastered the art of saying very, very sensitive things in language that that no one can touch, she has been utterly blunt in saying, basically, we've spent the kitty. They entered the war with, what was it, some $150 billion in the kitty bank, in the rainy day fund. Several very competent economists, Russian and foreign, are all saying by the end of this year, very early next year, that'll be gone. So in addition to a stalemate on the front line, and in other words, the Ukrainians more than holding their own, and the Ukrainians destroying the logistic structure that the Russian side depends upon, you have the economic crisis, and that is unavoidable. And really, there's no easy path out for Russia. It's all over.
Fred, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the really kind of astounding losses that the Russians have incurred, both in men and materiel. I mean, British intelligence says there are now well over 1 million casualties, with probably maybe as many as a quarter of those killed in action. I mean, these are staggering numbers, compared to Afghanistan, or certainly they're on
or even the Russo-Japanese War, right?
Yeah, I mean, they're just really quite extraordinary. And I noted that Putin just the other day said, well, nobody has died in vain, although it would seem that, all of them have died in vain, given what you were just saying. How is this being processed, in the Telegram channels that you're monitoring?
Well, it's being processed because forget the body bags. Hundreds of thousands of bodies don't come back, and their history is will be the work of separate books in the future. I'm sure people will write about it, but the fact is that this has absolutely depleted their labor supply. There are now women on the front line. In the last week, there are several groups of women who've been leaping out of these armored personnel carriers and getting blown up. That's all been reported. And they've run out. They're hiring people from all over the world, including Cuba, but many, many other places, including Central Asia, let it be said. These people are untrained. They're unqualified. They don't know what they're doing. And worst of all, they can't communicate with their Russian counterparts. So what do you do? Beyond this is something that we're not talking about here, and we should. This is the time to do it. And that is, what happens in Russia after this? If we're going to have grand strategy, you don't just stop it at this latest report from the front line in Ukraine. No, you think, what if Russia is on really in a desperate state from which it's not going to recover quickly? If that's truly the case, think of all the billions of dollars of manufacturing capacity that Putin has shifted to military. So instead of making widgets, your company is now making mortar shells. Now, that's fine. In the short run, you're being paid for it, but the money to pay that is running out. But worse than that, if the war were to end tomorrow, the cost of going back to the production of widgets is immense. And it will take years and years and years. Now, in our strategic calculation, I see no discussion of Russia post this war. People are fascinated. Will Putin survive? Well, no, we're all mortal. He won't survive either. What will come after? Well, there have been other disastrous Russian wars. There were several very prominent Americans saying, well, including foreigners. The president of Kazakhstan said it at one point, that Russia never loses wars. Well, what about the Crimean War, for example, the Russo-Japanese War, which were disasters? Incidentally, both of them were followed by dramatic periods of reform, a complete turnover in top personnel. This is something we should be thinking about. We should, if we're talking grand strategy, this has to be part of it, yet I don't hear it.
Can I ask you to just develop a little bit more? It's an unsustainable situation, as you said. I mean, I think you say it a lot more clearly and forcefully than some others, but there, some other people have indicated that they're under a lot of strain. In terms of the ways you can see this playing out, I mean, one, I suppose, would be, Putin understands that the jig is up and he tries to cut some sort of deal with Trump by which he can hold on to as much of Ukraine as possible. But I suppose another kind of possibility is there's a real major rupture where, the state is, you in effect have some sort of popular uprising or something like that. I suppose a third possibility is elite politics take over and, somebody kills Putin in his sleep or something like that. Of those three, first, is that the spectrum of possibilities, or are there something else I'm not thinking of? And
I think
what
that's
do you think is most likely?
absolutely correct. However, I'd add one. One cannot rule out the possibility of Putin trying to do something truly wild and bizarre, like attacking in the Baltic. I mean, look what's going on the border of Lithuania as we speak, or in the southwest, in Moldova, or in Armenia and the Caucasus. These are all they're clear evidence. These are all under consideration. I don't rule out the possibility as one of the hypotheses of Putin ordering a kind of last-ditch assault on one of these regions or several of them. Now, the qualifier to that is that he may not find that the Russian military is prepared to follow, because it's a proud military. You go to their headquarters. I've been there. You see portraits of all the great figures all the way back to Tolstoy's time, War and Peace time. And they are acutely aware that they have been discredited beyond imagination by this war. And if orders come down to the military to take some extreme measures, including, by the way, nuclear ones, but I don't think it's can be assumed that the military will follow them. That could trigger internal revolt.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, Eliot and I have discussed for better part of 2 years the question of how long the Russian military can sustain these kinds of losses. I mean, you talked about the Crimean War and the Russo-Japanese War. I mean, also in World War I, you had actually the collapse of the Russian army on the front, and then at turning their guns on the officers and the enlisted personnel. And I mean,
that has happened already in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, and you got. In this instance, you've also had, in some sense, I think, a deprofessionalization of some of the military on the front. And you have all these indications of the military devolving into a kind of organized crime elements. And to your point of what happens at the end of all this, when all of what's left of this repatriates back into Russia, You've already had instances. I've seen anecdotally of some of the criminals who were recruited, who went and fought and then have gone back and are wreaking havoc in Russian hamlets and towns. What do you think the potential for a collapse of the military is?
I think it's begun. And the question is how far and how fast it will proceed. The fact that this new heavy reliance on foreigners, and where are they getting the money for that? Ask Miss Nabiulina. She'll say we don't have it. She said this very bluntly. So I think we have to assume that among the scenarios, the four that we've listed together, the most disruptive ones, the most discontinuous ones, are the most likely. And where does that leave you? Well, that's where you have to raise question about generational turnover, because Putin is getting a little long in the tooth, and all his key allies are of similar age. They're grandfathers, and there are young people in Russia. There are very talented and well-educated ones. There are hundreds of thousands who left under the right circumstances might return. So I think one thing we can be absolutely confident of is that there will be a dramatic generational turnover within the very coming period.
Could I ask you to characterize first the Russian elite, that younger swath of the Russian elite that is already, they are there. They're not in charge, but they're in government. They're in the business world.
Or abroad.
Yeah, or abroad. What do you think they are like? But then also as a broader Russian society. I mean, I think it is. I'm not a Russianist, but I have to say I was sort of surprised by the passivity of Russian society in the face of these extraordinary losses, particularly when compared, say, with Afghanistan. Now, that was, of course, a different period with different leadership. I understand all that. But still, the degree of passivity in the face of a million casualties, plus all the other things you've been talking about, and a war that's clearly not going well, I find extraordinary. So if you could talk about both of those, I'd be grateful.
The passivity is less than appears. How many governors have been sacked and jailed because they're not keeping the lid on? They've been very, very tough on the local leadership, but the local leadership has been astonishingly rebellious at key points. And if you follow the Duma, if you have truly nothing more productive to do in life, I suggest you take a watch of Duma debates. But in the last 6 months, 8 months, they absolutely, they don't speak about the war necessarily, or they didn't. Now they do. But they spoke about local conditions with absolute bluntness, saying this is unacceptable, this is a disgrace to our people, it's discrediting. And then they link it. First, they said it's linked to the local leaders, local government. But then they shifted to attacking our leadership, and then our leaders, and finally, nowadays, you'll hear the name Putin. So it's not as passive as it looks. Although, generally speaking, if you're willing to exert the degree of force that the Russian state has at its disposal, you can shut people up, and that would probably happen anywhere.
Or push them out of 40-story windows, which has happened
That's right.
with distressing regularity to a lot of business leaders who haven't ponied up, I guess.
But a word about the business. This is an important dimension. We keep talking about the oligarchs. Well, there are guys who are oligarchs because they stole it all back in 30 years ago. But there are also some very smart, modern type business people. What has gone almost unreported here is that Putin has basically shaken them down. He's gone to the biggest people with the biggest checkbooks and said, "Look, write it over to me," and they've done it. But this is not done without any reaction from the other side. This action, shaking down the business leaders for the billions that he doesn't have, that he is actually spending. This is one of the key sources of change, and it may be actually made point in a fairly positive direction for the future, because some of the better business people will still be around. They say, we don't want a system that will ever allow this again.
I will confess, watching all of this, and like needless to say, I've been doing a lot more reading about Russian history and culture than I used to. It is tempting to become a sort of a Russia essentialist, say, look, this place just always, it was autocracy and repression. And, I was reading the letters of the Marquis de Custine and kind of checking that off and looking at my notes from the wonderful history courses I took with Dick Pipes. And I wonder what your view of that is. I mean, what is the range of Russian futures in terms of, say, decent, responsible government, even if it doesn't quite look like Sweden? But or is this a country that, for a variety of reasons, is probably always going to have a very strong authoritarian streak to it, and that will always be a problem for its neighbors?
Key question. It's the right question. Considering an answer, a key factor is there are two. First is that there, in fact, have been eras of great reform in Russia. In the middle of the 19th century, after the disaster in the Crimea, which we haven't discussed the current Crimean issue, which is a key one, but after the 19th century military disaster in Crimea, you had a whole new generation of reformers, really good, and they instituted a very up-to-date European, German basically, legal system that worked. And they instituted local elective self-government, which Tolstoy, Chekhov both actively participated in and thought it was the answer. And they did all sorts of good things. However, what causes the brakes every time to be put on? And what has caused the brakes to be put on after the collapse in 91? That's the key question. I think the answer is very clear. Empire. Russia, a little state of Muscovy, basically filled political vacuums on its periphery for 4 centuries, ending up with this immense territory, which they couldn't control, except through force. And it is this factor every time which has destroyed reform in Russia. And it did, for example, things were going swimmingly with the reformers after the Crimean War in the 1850s until the Poles decided to get a little boisterous. And that, again, the empire, the empire is at stake. This has been the key right through. Now, this is what happened in 91. We made the mistake of thinking that the Soviet system had collapsed. Well, it is true. The Communist Party of the USSR closed up shop. The next day it reopened as the Communist Party of Russia. And you did have 14 countries becoming independent, but you still had vast areas of Russia, including Ukraine, then part of Russia, that weren't happy with the status quo. So we've again relived this repeated effort to maintain a territory that is beyond their capacities. And the only thing they can do is to try to do it by force. But this is the last time. I can't imagine after this that who knows how much of Russia will survive? There are optimists and pessimists on that question, but I can't imagine a serious effort to reestablish imperial Russia after the collapse in Ukraine.
Fred, I'm curious about one thing, and I do want to get us onto using the empire motif that you've raised to some of the other parts of the, not just Ukraine, but some of the other parts of the former empire that are now independent states, about which you know a lot and which Americans are blithely kind of ignorant of, which is Central Asia. But before we go there, I'm curious for your sense of, how much of all this does Putin actually understand, realize? I mean, does he understand how much difficulty, he's in, how much the situation on the front has gone poorly, or is he being just fed a lot of, happy talk from all of his retainers?
Who knows? I think we have to wait a generation until some old timers in Moscow start issuing their memoirs. But my suspicion is this, that at a very early age, and this can be pretty well dated now, in the mid 90s, this nobody, I remember working with him when he was in the mayor's office in St. Petersburg. He was a nobody. The only person who was less significant in the office was Medvedev, who sat outside the mayor's door on a little desk looking like nobody, and from whom one would order coffee when you wanted coffee. But this nobody in the 90s, and it's a process that is best described in a remarkable book about the ideology of Russia, done by an Englishman named Clover. In the 90s, he embraced this imperial ideology, and and yes, it's true. Dugin played a part in it. Dugin was my guest in Washington for a week back in, I think, 2005, 2006. This was before the real Dugin had stepped out, but Dugin only put the trimming on the cake that was already there, because there were many other influences, and this is all that Putin is. This is his ideology. Yes, he was surprised to be made president, and he made a few statements early along that seemed to be very conciliatory to the West, but little by little, he realized that that his mission in life was connected with the reestablishment of Russian power and sovereignty, all the places where it should be reestablished. And once you have that fixation in your head, information is irrelevant. And so I have no idea how much he realizes about reality. But his resistance to it is so profound. It is his identity. So, it seems to me all talk of concessions, maybe we can make a deal, we'll give them this territory as if it's ours to give. That's crazy. The only thing that we should be very firm in saying, Ukraine should get back its full territory as recognized by the UN and other international bodies and the US, full territory, which includes the territories now under occupation, and Crimea, crucially Crimea. That should be non-negotiable, but it's unfortunately going to be negotiable, I fear. But
notably, Russia, the Russian Federation, recognized those borders as well in several treaties and other documents.
Yeah, bravo. Agreements. Well, it seems to me that we must, if we insist on the 2014 borders, non-negotiable, let the Russians decide among themselves whether Putin continues or doesn't. They will decide, inevitable. But now, is that asking for victory? No. It's the return to the status ante quem. And that should be American policy without apologies. We are not in a moral or practical condition to engage in negotiation over these territories. It won't work. And any effort on our side to do so will be discrediting to America's credibility for years and years to come.
You know, Fred, I could very, very easily spend hours listening to you on Russia and asking you questions, but I'm just keeping an eye on the clock. I really would like to hear you talk about Central Asia and the Caucasus. You know, one thing I think I'm acutely aware of for myself, but I think this speaks to kind of the broader American community of people who are interested in foreign policies. We know virtually nothing about Central Asia. We don't pay attention to it. We just assume that it's a bunch of former Soviet republics, although that was, you know, by now, like over a generation ago, as if nothing in particular has happened and as if it's sort of a backwater. And I don't think either of those are really true anymore, but I was wondering if you could just kind of begin by walking us through, why we should care about Central Asia, but also what have been some of the changes since the breakup of the Soviet Union?
Central Asia, it's a funny term, but Central Asia is as much the heartland of Islam as any region, including the Arab world. Central Asians, people who ethnically, linguistically, and culturally were part of the Central Asian world, even if they may have had links to the Persian world or to the Turkic world and so on, as they did, they were nonetheless defined, above all, by a very learned tradition that existed in Central Asia. It goes back to the centuries before Islam, when there were Buddhists all over the place. It was these Buddhists in Central Asia who translated the Buddhist texts from India and sent them to China. They didn't go over the Himalayas. They went through Central Asia. And so this is a serious region. And it produced many of those geniuses whom we call Arab intellectuals, or they aren't Arabs. They're Turkic or Persianate, especially Persianate, not Iranian, but Persianate peoples living in Central Asia. The whole medical field worldwide was created by one of these folks, Avicenna, Ibn Sina. I wrote his biography, published it recently. One of these geniuses from this forgotten region measured the Earth more accurately than anyone down to the 17th century, and also hypothesized the existence of North and South America as inhabited continents 1,000 years ago. So this isn't some insignificant backwater. This is a very serious territory. And of course, it was then swept under under Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union, heavily Sovietized. And then suddenly, with no one anticipating it, they gained independence in 1991. Now, I remember our mutual friend, Zbig Brzezinski, writing about this as the arc of instability. Well, I think today it's much more nearly the arc of stability, at least the Central Asian part. Things are a little rougher in the Caucasus, but totally due to Moscow's misbehavior in Ukraine. The Central Asians have been intimidated from linking arms. It's the only world region without its own organizations that are exclusively theirs. ASEAN, Nordic Council, all these exist. Nothing like this yet in Central Asia. However, they have figured out that they have to link arms. And so they're doing it very delicately, very subtly, and very effectively. And it's a pity that no American president has shown up in Central Asia ever. Even during the period we were in Afghanistan, which is, by the way, part of Central Asia, and all the Central Asians view it that way. No American president showed up in Central Asia. Now, why is this of any importance to us when we're fixated on bigger issues, China especially? Well, very simply, that if you look at the map, you have this vast territory between heartland Russia, heartland China, the Arab world to the southwest, Iran, and then the Indian Pakistani world to the south. You have this vast territory, enormous, heavily rich in resources, extremely rich in resources, everything imaginable. And Afghanistan is part of that list, of course. If this territory were to fall under either the control of malign outside forces, and let's be blunt at this point, that means Russia or China, just as it has meant earlier, radical Islamists. If any of these things were to happen, it would create an absolute arc of autocracy, if you will, going from the Korean-Chinese border in one corner all the way to the Persian Gulf on the other. Now, do we want that? You know, and yet they're doing surprisingly well. Both there are problems states among them. We could go into that, but overall, they've survived. They've asserted their sovereignty. They've created effective institutions that are enabled now to work together more and more. So I think just to say our interest is to invest there is to grossly understate the meaning of this entire region for America's core interests.
Fred, let me just try and draw you out a little bit on that. Kazakhstan, for instance, has enormous reserves, some of the world's largest reserves of uranium. There are a lot of other, minerals and rare earths in other parts of Central Asia. You talked about Afghanistan, which is rich in copper and other resources. Turkmenistan, very important for gas, and Kazakhstan, of course, also for hydrocarbon resources. My sense is that under, for instance, President Tokayev in Kazakhstan, these countries are really quite anxious to A, maintain their independence, and B, not be dominated by either Russia or China. And so it would seem that it's a natural place for us to be a kind of neutral, kind of balancing force. Am I misreading it, or is that how the region sort of looks at it?
I think you've stated it beautifully. This is and they want that. The concept of balance, they don't want to be controlled by anyone, and therefore they all have adopted a de facto strategy of balancing, using China to balance Russia, and hopefully the West, meaning America and European Union, and friendly powers like South Korea and Japan, to balance Russia and China. That's their formula. It makes sense, and it happens to coincide with our interests very nicely. Now, therefore, it seems to me it's not enough simply to say, as we're now saying, that we are going to facilitate American investment there. That's very good, and bravo that that's happening. But it has to be much more extensive than that, and it has to include discussion of security.
Can you talk a bit about how, and of course, we're talking about a vast region and a number of different countries. You may want to break it down country by country. To what extent are these cohesive societies and effective governments, effective, legitimate governments? I mean, are those? I mean, I get that sense about some of those countries, but say less. I don't know, maybe Tajikistan or something like that. But I'd be curious to hear your overall view of that.
Maybe I'm guilty of optimism, excessive optimism, but I think they've done a remarkable job. Uzbekistan, for example, had a very, very tough-minded ruler, Karimov, for a generation. And when he visited Washington around 2007, he was asked at a dinner, "Hey, what's going to happen? He said, when are you going to loosen the reins a bit and enter the modern world?" Basically, he gave a very revealing response. He said, "Listen, we can't do this tomorrow morning." He said, "We don't know how to. We don't have the knowledge or experience to do it, which is why we're sending thousands of our kids to study here in America." He said, when they come back, and I'm quoting his words, they're more like you than like us. And then he went on, "They're still ours." And these are the people who are doing. Well, now that is exactly what's happening today. You have a new generation across the region, very savvy, very cosmopolitan. They know languages. They've lived abroad. They're involved with international business. They're transforming the region. And the old dogs who were formed under communism are fading very fast. And even the initial generation of leaders has faded. So I think there's reason to be quite optimistic about. They're very savvy people. They have a rich and serious intellectual tradition. They want to team up with us, not at the exclusion of their other relationships, but to keep them under control.
I don't doubt that a number of the people you're talking about were Rumsfeld fellows who went through the Central Asia Caucasus Institute that you run, and I had the privilege of speaking to a lot of those folks, and I do think it's actually one of the nicer parts of Don Rumsfeld's legacy, because he was, like you, very convinced that Central Asia had enormous importance and had the foresight to endow that program, which I do think is.
Let me add a wild Rumsfeldism. When Don Rumsfeld and I got together and schemed and planned to create this Rumsfeld Fellowship Program with our institute and his foundation, it was clear we were talking about Central Asia. But no, you can't just do that. You have to add the Caucasus. And then this was still, U.S. was still in Afghanistan, and there were some optimistic prognoses of developments there. And so, yes, let's add Afghanistan as well. Then Don Rumsfeld came up with something that absolutely astonished me and everyone else. He said, let's add Mongolia. And we did. And it was a very, very prescient move on Rumsfeld's part, which I was a skeptic, but he was right. And because now they realize we share so much, and so this arc, if you will, of Central Asia is expanding rather than shrinking. The Central Asians are working like mad to re-engage, yes, the Taliban, to re-engage with Afghanistan as we sit here. Will they succeed? How far? I don't know. There are obvious impediments, and I'm not suggesting that the U.S. rush into this game. But the Central Asians are, and especially on the issue of transport, because they realize it's life or death for them. If they don't get routes open to the south, they're going to be controlled by Moscow and China. Simple as that.
How difficult is it for China and Russia to exert malign influence, not by straightforward economic coercion, but corruption, manipulation. I mean, all the, the kind of stuff that you saw vis-a-vis Ukraine, actually for many years, and to some extent you still see, where they're, they can sort of insert their tentacles in a somewhat subterranean way, and either try to control a state or at least to weaken it. Or is the Central Asian case different?
Yes and no. Some are definitely different. Others are only marginally different. But what's very interesting is that, in addition, when they shed the Soviet system, they shed Soviet laws, and this sent them into a mad scramble to come up with the best formulae from abroad, especially from Europe and America. That is just in its early stages still, but you can see real progress there. So I think the corruption that emanates from Russia and infuses to some degree the economies of Central Asia and the Caucasus, it's not a secret anymore. People know who it is and how it works, and the governments are out to get it and to purge themselves of those who have perpetrated it. So again, I think it's fair to say that in 2025, corruption in Central Asia is on its back foot. It's probably peaked. It's still very considerable. There are big fortunes. We're talking about a lot of money coming down from Russia, vast amounts of money. Look at Georgia. It was bought by Russian money, by Mr. Ivanishvili. But I think that peaked with the peak of the pre-2015 Putin era.
Yeah. So actually, could we use that as a segue to get you talking a bit about, we're almost out of time, I realize, talking about the Caucasus, which, again, sort of the general impression one has is this is a mess. Georgia really kind of fallen into the Russian orbit. Obviously, Chechnya in the grips of a pretty evil dictator, but lots of instability in other parts of the Caucasus as well. Is that the right way to understand it, or how should we think about the Caucasus?
It's perfectly fair to understand it that way. However, take it country by country. Start with the biggest country and the richest country, and that is Azerbaijan. It ain't perfect. They do dumb things, which there are smart Azerbaijanis who regret it. But on the whole, they've been very subtle and tenacious in opening their windows to the West and opening the East-West transport through their country and through the rest of the Caucasus. Hugely important, because if you don't have that, all the transport goes through Russia. So Azerbaijan, if you go to not just Baku, other cities, it's thriving. They've done a lot of very smart things, and they, of course, have a lot of oil. You can't deny that. Georgia was thriving too, very successfully. But this Ivanishvili, the guy who brought a satchel full of money back from his days in Moscow and took over a lot of real estate, and at his country house established a zoo with zebras. Can you imagine zebras in Georgia? Ivanishvili basically destroyed the structure that had been laboriously created, but with hand in hand with America and Europe since 1991. He single-handedly destroyed this, and his folks are in control. Armenia, another situation. Armenia was foolishly allowed itself to be locked for 2 generations into the Karabakh War. Eventually, they lost, period. End of story. Now, since then, a new government has emerged. We'll see how long they last in Armenia, which is following the old Georgian playbook. They're looking to the West, they're looking to France, Europe, and America to reopen links that have been closed for 2 generations. Now, all 3 of these, at this moment, their worst tendencies, their worst problems all arise from Moscow. Be utterly blunt about it. And which is why, by the way, Azerbaijan, it's not just because the Russians shot down an Azerbaijani airliner on December 25th, 2024, that crystallized the whole thing. But from that moment, so half a year, the Azeris have been blunt beyond blunt about their relationship to Moscow and of Mr. Putin, and to the point that they're even in the Azeri press today, they're referring to Königsberg, not Kaliningrad, Königsberg. This is absolutely, it shows how these are all linked on the periphery of the old Russian Empire. The Balts and the Central Asians, the Balts and the Caucasus, they're all in touch with each other. So I think all 3 of these countries have been profoundly affected by Russian actions under Putin. And again, I think the inevitable impending end of Putin's reign is going to bring about absolutely fundamental shifts in the Caucasus as well as the rest of Central Asia. We can speak of it as a greater Central Asia, which has a certain identity of its own.
Fred, we are running out of time, and which I regret, because I think we could go on for a very long time with this conversation. Before we end, though, I would really appreciate, as a former U.S. ambassador to Turkey, your view on how the Turks and the Iranians are playing in Central Asia. I mean, I remember a time when, in the immediate aftermath of the Soviet Union, when U.S. policymakers were very anxious to make sure that it was Turkish influence in Central Asia that predominated rather than Iranian, on the theory that secular Turkey was a much better model for Central Asia and Central Asian Islam than anything that would be coming out of Tehran. Of course, it looks a lot different now in Turkey, given where Turkey is. I'm just curious how you see those 2 playing into this.
Iran has a problem in Central Asia. The one Persianate people in Central Asia, and meaning in Tajikistan, half of Uzbekistan, and all of northern Afghanistan are
Tajiks.
Persianate. Tajiks, they go by different names, but speaking a variety of Persian, but not the same Persian you hear on the street in Tehran. So when the Iranians came after the collapse of the Soviet Union, started, beating their chest and saying we should be your model, they looked on the Iranians as a bunch of nobodies. Wait a minute, who provided all the great intellectuals? We did. They weren't from a state called Iran. They were Persianate, many of them, but that doesn't mean they're Iranians. And anyway, you guys went over to Shia, and we never did. And so we're the bearers of the great tradition that you guys have. So much for Iran. I don't see that changing dramatically, although there are very sophisticated people, even now in Tehran, who view all this in a very different light. We could discuss that another time. As for Turkey, we share a common affection there. I began my career doing archaeological work in Turkey, at Gordium, where Alexander cut the Gordian knot. Today's Erdogan, my goodness, how many years, months, days, hours does he yet have? The clock's running out, but their dying gesture of his regime has been a very bumptious move towards Central Asia and the Caucasus. And now, this is good, and the Central Asians and people in the Caucasus welcome it with a degree of caution, but they're very savvy and know what's going on. This is a business proposition from Tehran, and it's supported by from Ankara, and it's supported by Turkish business. That is fine if it leads to investment. The Central Asians and Caucasus welcome it. However, when it goes beyond that, as it easily does, and the talk of a Turkic world, well, that's a loser in the long run. And I think the absence of any serious Western, meaning Euro-American, link institutional structure to interact with the region leaves it wide open to Turkey, and we should be grateful that they're doing something when we're doing nothing. But I don't think this is a long-lasting program that you see.
Well, our guest has been Fred Starr. I think our listeners and viewers, after listening to this, will have a better sense of what Eliot and I already know, which is the amazing capaciousness of Fred's intellect and his contribution to scholarship and policy. So, Fred, thank you. I think we may want to have you back, from time to time as we try and get a little bit more attention from our listeners and viewers to a part of the world that they don't know about, but probably should.
Fred, thanks so much.
Well, I thank you. What a wonderful thing you are putting together and maintaining in these difficult times.